does that kind of undermine the whole like idealist materialist dichotomy that is usually Hegel is thrown into the idealist camp and
Yeah.
how Marx defines his whole thing, right?
Yeah, Tony, you're saying my rosary. Yes, that's I despise this distinction when referencing to Hegel because I think Hegel just absolutely rejects it. Because so there's a whole thing. Hegel was always classified as idealist by Marxists. Slavoj comes along and says, no, he's really a materialist. And I just think, no, his whole point is you can't make that division. It's just it's untenable from his perspective because every idea implies a kind of action associated with it. Even the one that's what's the most retreat from the world? Stoicism. That's the position, interestingly, Hegel had the absolute most contempt for. For him to call someone, this was his absolute worst insult. He didn't call you a motherfucker. He said, you're monkish. He said, you're monkish. That was his number one insult because he thought stoicism or monkishness is an attempt to retreat from the world and not act out something. But then he shows in Phenomenology of Spirit in the self-consciousness section, one little section called Stoicism, he shows, oh no, the Stoic really is, there's certain actions implicit in Stoicism that show that the Stoic really is invested in the world that they retreat from. So it, yeah, I think he totally rejects that barrier between idealism and materialism.
Hegel aside, do you think just this dichotomy is useful, period?
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/one dime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I'm here with a very special guest, a guest I had on my list for a very, very long time, a collaboration that many people have requested. And I think we're going to take a break from the economics arc and get into psychoanalysis. And my guest today is Todd McGowan, a professor, philosopher, author of numerous books, most notably, and at least in terms of the ones I've read, are Emancipation After Hegel and Capitalism and Desire. Today we're going to talk about psychoanalysis primarily and what is probably the thought taboo that often prevents a lot of people from taking psychoanalysis seriously, and that is the founder of it, Sigmund Freud. Is Freud outdated? Is he even relevant? What are the misconceptions regarding Freud? We're going to get into all of that today, but without further ado, I guess first and foremost, Todd, I want to just allow you to introduce yourself and just maybe add the things that I haven't incorporated already and what brought you to psychoanalysis, because it's kind of, I guess you could say you're not a analyst, right? So I
No, no,
mean,
no.
what brought you to it?
Tony, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me. Hopefully you won't think I should have waited longer to have him on after we after we do this thing. And hopefully I'll still be in that economics arc because I have written a couple books on capitalism and psychoanalysis, so maybe there'll be some touchstones there. Yeah, so what brought me to psychoanalysis? So I was initially probably like most people, and I wasn't resistant, but I was more I would call myself an existentialist Marxist. And so I was very indebted to Jean-Paul Sartre. I was not, and Marx, and I was not necessarily interested in Freud and Lacan when I first read them. And it was really to the moment when I read Slavoj's Sublime Object of Ideology. That's the book that made me think, oh, maybe there's something in psychoanalysis that I can find helpful. And my dissertation director in graduate school was also heavily influenced by Freud. And so that those things pushed me in that direction. And then I was able to see the way in which, at least from my perspective, psychoanalysis had a lot to say about understanding social forces, the way they're acting on us, and then understanding our existential problematic. So I didn't so much give up my other concerns as fit psychoanalysis into them, which is why you say I'm not I have gone to an analyst, so I've seen it from the patient side, but never from the practitioner side. So yeah, that which there are certain people that say I have no right to even write about psychoanalysis because I've never been an analyst. Fair enough, maybe that's true.
Well, that would discourage Zizek, wouldn't it?
They would, right? Because Slavoj is everything but an analyst. He would never. He would describe himself as someone who could never be an analyst, and that's how I feel about myself. So yeah, for me, psychoanalysis is important theoretically. I'm not against it as a practice. That's just not my concern. I mean, I know analysts. I have friends that are analysts, but it's not my focus.
So then why is psychoanalysis useful? Kind of before we get into it, I mean, I find it very useful, but it's from an audience perspective, like why even know this if not trying to become an analysis and if become an analyst, and if, one wants to be analyzed, why not just go to the analyst? Why even bother knowing, what's the use?
Right. It's a good question, I think, Tony. And I think that for me, it comes down to two fundamental ideas. And I think that they really help us both to understand ourselves and to understand how society works, politics, culture, relationships. And those ideas are the unconscious. And I think that's the biggest. So you said this is what Freud got right in Defense of Psychoanalysis. You titled the episode. That seems to me a big thing that he got right. And I think okay, you can say there's certain people that think about the unconscious before Freud. Schelling uses the term, but no one really thinks about, Schopenhauer uses the term, but no one really thinks about it in the way that Freud does as an agent, a psychic agency that's separate from consciousness, right? So I think that's a really important, the power that the unconscious has over us. I think that's something that's helpful for someone who, that has nothing even to do with analysis as a practice. So that's the one thing. And I think the other thing is an idea that came to Freud late in his lifetime. It's this idea of death drive. And I think it's linked to unconscious. And the idea is not that we are driven to die or seek out our death, but that we are constantly sabotaging our own self-interest or our own good, our own projects. And that, I think that also is really helpful if you think about the way that, say, in your romantic life, you repeat several bad relationships, or every time at work when things are going well, then you find a way to sabotage that. Or the way a country maybe elects someone not really qualified to be president. Like those things, I think psychoanalysis helps us to understand better than any other way of thinking. So for me, that's the real, you asked about that, to me, that is the use value of it.
Death drive was a huge game changer for me in terms of how I saw behavior, and we'll get into that after. But yeah, I think, maybe as a pitch, I would say for people who want to get into this and learn about it a little bit. I mean, I find just even reading people, you can just read people better in terms of understanding what they're doing. Just the idea of unconscious being linked to language intrinsically, and that taking the idea of people's slips of the tongue very seriously changes how you might, read somebody. Because like mainstream psychology doesn't actually, take the slips of the tongue that seriously. They often see it as kind of murmurings, or often random, not something linked to unconscious psyche. But yeah, I guess the first thing I was going to get into is what you brought up already, is the unconscious. Because, Freud's ideas get kind of buried now with the rise of empirical psychology. And, the likes of nowadays, you have like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is
Right.
far bigger and more mainstream than the likes of, psychoanalysis, and neuroscience has often, I guess you could call the neuroscientification of psychology, has led to a sort of dismissal of things that can't outright be proved
Right.
empirically. Now, that aspect I think is worth maybe highlighting, the unconscious itself, because it seems like that's an idea of Freud that we have accepted, but obviously Freud's concept of the unconscious is radically different from that of the way it's seen scientifically, like
Right.
in a
Right.
literal sense.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah.
So I think the way that gets thought about among the people that you're referencing is it gets turned into what's not conscious, right? So unconscious and not conscious are very different things. And it's interesting because the common word for unconscious in German when Freud was writing was bewusstlos, which means basically without consciousness, right? And the term he uses did exist, unbewusst. So he adds the un in the beginning, just like in English. That did exist, but it wasn't the common term. And I think he really wanted to emphasize that it's an agency. It's not just the absence of conscious knowledge. And in fact, not only is it an agency, it is the driving agency. And he thinks most of our activity is unconscious. And then consciousness is he describes it sometimes as a layer over the psyche that allows for interaction with the world, but basically is not driving the ship. And I think that's that's much different than cognitive behavioral therapists think about it, because they think if you just cognitively work out a certain kind of discipline, then you're going to correct what the problem is. For instance, I have terrible insomnia. I've been twice to a cognitive behavioral therapist, and they said, look, our success rate is 95%. It's going to work, no problem. And they give me the routine. And I obeyed it religiously. And I ended up staying up for 4 nights without any sleep. And it was terrible. And finally, I got to the end and I was at my last appointment. And she said, well, you're just one of the 5% that just failed. So sorry, we'll see you. Go take drugs. So there, I thought that was interesting because it shows that there's a certain limit that kind of thing comes up against. And for me, this is probably my interest in psychoanalysis probably ruined me as a candidate for cognitive behavioral therapy because I was always thinking, wait a minute, unconsciously, I'm aware that I'm trying to do this to fall asleep and then it's not. So yeah, I think that the way what's not conscious or what's called unconscious today is conceived is not what Freud means, because what Freud means is this agency that's driving the ship and subverting consciousness. And I think that's a really key idea of psychoanalysis, that it's subverting consciousness.
And it's not like this literal part of the brain that you can pinpoint right on it, when scanning, because people talk about how, for example, like psychedelics allow your unconscious mind to communicate with parts of your conscious mind, or, some people, they'll try to, like, neuroscientific studies will identify parts of the brain that aren't active. But the subconscious for Freud is kind of like it's not like a literal dividing line. We're kind of
Right.
always like doing a lot of activity unconsciously, not being aware, and it means something very different than this literal physical thing.
Right. In fact, I think that right. For sure, it's not a physical space for Freud in the brain. He didn't think that, and I think Freud is much more. I think it's better. He didn't see himself so much this way, but I think it's much better to think of Freud as a philosopher than a psychologist, because I think he's trying to come up with a theory for why we are doing what we are doing, and then I think if you understand unconscious in that way, it makes a lot more sense. It's not just a place; it's a way of acting, a way of conducting oneself.
I mean, that itself is actually, you drop that's a big claim, right? Freud is better taken seriously as a philosopher than an analyst. I've heard you say that before on your podcast, Why Theory, with Ryan Angley.
Yeah.
And, why is that important? Because Freud definitely saw himself as like trying to do a science, right?
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. That's what It's interesting though, because when Freud was very young, he dreamed of becoming a philosopher. And then he realized he wasn't going to be a great philosopher. And then he basically turned to medicine and science and psychology. And he did think, oh, someday my ideas will be proven scientifically. But I think it's oftentimes the case, and this is a very psychoanalytic idea, that we don't understand what we're really doing. And I think that's true of Freud too, that his main was most of what he's doing is philosophical theorizing. And it's not scientific analysis. And it's theorizing done through obviously analysis of patients, seeing how people act. What you just said before about the way that psychoanalysis can give us a better way of reading people. I think that was really important to Freud, how we're constantly reading. He often said, everybody practices psychoanalysis all the time because they're constantly reading the unconscious of everybody they interact with. Somebody acts, they make certain gestures when they're talking to us, and we can tell, oh, they don't really want, they're ready for me to leave. They're ready for me to stop talking. Or I can tell this person's into me, or so, all those things, right? Like those are for Freud. Those are ways in which we're practicing the art of psychoanalysis in our daily lives.
Hmm. So, I think we should maybe clarify the type of Freudian perspective you're coming from, because you come from, could we describe it as Zizek'ian in a sense, in that the Zizek'ian views tend to involve like Lacan, Freud, and well, Lacan, which is Freud, I call Super Saiyan Freud,
Yeah.
with Hegel, and
Yeah, that is
you have
true.
your own differences with Slavoj, right? But
Right. Slavoj and I have some differences, but I think it is true that the way of seeing the connection between psychoanalysis and Hegel is now visible to a lot of people. So I think many of the best books written on Hegel have a real psychoanalytic bent to them. Rebecca Comet's Morning Sickness, Catherine Malibu's The Future of Hegel, etc. But, and it's not to mention Slavoj's. So that's what I think is the key thing, that he connects. And I don't think anybody before Slavoj saw that connection, inclusive, definitely true of Freud. Freud mentions Hegel on 2 occasions, both times in footnotes, just in passing, and it's clear he never read him. Freud just never read Hegel. Lacan read Hegel, but through the lens of this early 20th century philosopher Alexander Kojève, who has a very particular reading of Hegel. So it seems like Lacan is attacking Hegel quite a bit. And Slavoj was really the first to say, okay, no, he's not attacking him. He's actually developing a Hegelian idea in the guise of an attack. So in that sense, yeah, I'm following in that lineage of Slavoj by connecting psychoanalysis and really all of German idealism. So Kant, Fichte, Hegel, Schelling.
and perhaps the most crucial point of emphasis would be the Lacanian view, because of course there's many Freudians, right?
Right,
There's
right,
ego
right.
psychology, which
Sure.
a completely separate thing, right? So
Sure.
like, yeah, I guess
But I
that's pretty.
think go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just saying like that to establish. I mean, what does it mean to come from a Lacanian view on Freud, and why is Lacan so important to Freud? Because that'll kind of contextualize all the questions we're going to get to when it comes to what Freud got wrong and right from this sort of
Yeah.
viewpoints, right?
Yeah. I mean, for sure, I think Lacan helps to clarify certain. Oh, that's ironic to say because Lacan is anything but a clear writer. But I think he does help to clarify certain things in Freud and what Freud's fundamental concerns are. But I'm not sure how much he really departs. I think there are a couple places where he's saying something a little different, but I think to me, the other thinkers, that these other lines of thought that you're right, link back to Freud, object relations, ego psychology. I, I guess for me, I think they're building on Freud and then doing something else. Whereas I take Lacan really at his word that he's returning to Freud and really helping us to clarify what's at stake in the Freudian project. So I don't necessarily think Lacan himself said this funny thing. He says, it's up to you if you want to be Lacanian, but I'm Freudian. Mais moi, je suis Freudien. So I kind of think that's how he thought of himself. He's just extending or following even the Freudian project.
Right, he called himself the like a true Freudian,
Yeah.
trying to rescue, I guess, misinterpretations of Freud and trying to
Yeah.
clarify that. So that, I guess we can just kind of go into the Freud ideas through Lacan or sorry, like Freud and Lacan's ideas kind of at the same time, in that
Right.
Lacan's ideas are sort of just extensions or elaborations or clarifications of original Freud concepts, like that one you alluded to, the death drive. But I guess let's start at the unconscious, since we've already unpacked
Yeah.
part of it. Lacan famously says the unconscious is structured like a language.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah. This is not my favorite aphorism by Lacan because
Yeah.
I think it's a little misleading. Later he says, I always said the unconscious is structured as like a language, but never the unconscious is language. So he does make that distinction. And I think what he was trying to get at was the thing that you made an allusion to at the very beginning about the slip. The logic of the way the logic of the slip works is the way for him, I think that's what that aphorism means, is the way that the logic of the unconscious works, right? That it makes connections between things that don't necessarily have a logical connection and even can be contradictory, but they connect on the level of signification. And that's why they're connected in the psyche. And then that 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 gives them the affect that they have, and that's why we're drawn to them. So I think that's what, to me, that's all that means, is that there's a structure that it makes connections in akin to the way that language makes connections. And if you see that, then you see how our desire is triggered by certain things that maybe don't seem directly related to what we desire, right? It's a little off. But it's because of some connection, like the connection between words or between signifiers. So I think that's what he's getting at. Again, I don't think I think that you're right, that's really a line that's become really associated with him. And he does repeat it. I don't know. It's just one of those. I'm a little resistant to this reduction of Lacan just to this thinker of language. And so I guess that's what I think that line is often used as part of that reduction.
Yeah, I'm more bring up the line to emphasize the slips that you just
Yeah,
mentioned.
yeah, yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, I might be forgetting exactly how the quote was, but didn't Lacan say something along the lines of, we always speak the truth, or something along those lines, which is, saying that even when people say what they didn't mean to say, they are saying something that's highly indicative of how they feel and think. And, those little moments where it might just seem random murmurings can often carry quite a bit of significance. And that is not a view that, all mainstream psychology necessarily espouses, but one that I find to be true, at least when I just in real life, like kind of how death drive doesn't seem to be empirically true. It's kind of very counter to the Darwinian common sense, but it just makes sense to me, like in the sense
Yeah.
when I see how people actually are.
Yeah. Yeah. This is what you said is so great. I totally agree with that. Like that I actually think that the notion of the slip is why Lacan said that line, right? Because and Freud said the slip that we make, and I think this is what, if people say, oh, that's a Freudian slip, this is what they kind of mean, although I'm not sure that they totally know. They just think, oh, that means a slip. But a Freudian slip means, oh, it has a significance. And his idea was, if you say afterward, wait a minute, I slipped and said the name, this happened to me on several occasions. I said the name of an ex-girlfriend in the place of a current girlfriend, right? Let's just keep them nameless. And I said, wait a minute. I met you, obviously. I didn't mean, and she was furious. She's furious with it. And Freud would say, rightfully so. And I think what's interesting is Lacan's whole sense of the relationship between the signifier and the signified is reducible to this notion of the Freudian slip, because the signifier is the word that I actually use, the name of the ex-girlfriend. But the signified is when I say, no, I mean you, my current girlfriend, don't worry. But Lacan's point is, and this is again Freud's point too, that the meaning, the signified, is actually secondary to the significance contained in the signifier itself. And that's why when we hear a slip like that, we take it seriously. Right. So I think you're really right to glom onto that example of the slip in reference to Lacan's statement about the unconscious structure like language. I think it's exactly correct.
So what are some other misconceptions regarding the unconscious, and you could say perhaps regarding even the Freudian ideas that are taken to be, have aged well, at least? Because we'll get into the ones that people really hate, like penis
Right.
envy
Right.
and
Right.
phallus. But I mean, like, the unconscious is one that people in talk therapy in general, that people seem to accept that, or the ego, people accept that. But like the way in which the public perception of it, or the Oedipus complex, right? It's
Right.
widely recognized that, parents have a huge role in the formation of a, person's subjectivity. But like, to what extent? Some people will say, well, Freud, he just wanted to bang his mom,
Yeah.
So kind of, I like tackle whichever one you feel makes the most sense to tackle first.
Yeah, there's a lot of things there.
'Cause it is hard. It is a very hard topic to structure, right? So, like,
It
if
is.
you
No,
feel one is better to go first, go
yeah,
ahead.
no,
Uh,
I'm
Go
totally
direct.
with you. It's a really hard, because there's so many mythologies, and I teach Freud all the time, and so it's a constant struggle how to break down barriers, especially if they've had psychology classes, and their common perception is Freud was just not that he wanted to bang his mother, that he's just a cocaine addict. And so I have to break through that and say that, well, I don't know. I think psychiatrists today prescribe drugs. They have no idea how they work, a lot more willy-nilly than Freud himself did with cocaine. But anyway, I I would just say the unconscious, the main thing, I think the way that it's not understood. So I was once in a class and students were basically rehashing things that they heard from, I don't know, psychology class or something. And someone said, someone in a film was peacocking. And they said, well, then their unconscious desire of the other character led them to that person peacocking because they realized they would be the best person to reproduce with. And I just said, okay, that's not unconscious because our inner biological structure that's not the unconscious. So that's what struck me as a real, and I think that's one way unconscious is understood today. It's it's biological instincts that we're not aware of that are guiding us. And for Freud, that's just not unconscious at all, because unconscious is unconscious desire, but it's the product of, and I think this is a really, really important, and I think how you think of this relationship determines what kind of thinker you are. So for Freud, the unconscious is the product of the collision between our biological instinct and the social order. And his idea is those two things don't just go together nicely. Because I think a lot of people would say, oh, I believe we're influenced by both things, biology and society, and they both mix together and create who we are. But Freud didn't think that. Freud thought, no, our biology comes into a collision with our social structure, and then that creates individual subjects of desire. And I think that is an unconscious desire, right? And that idea of the unconscious, I don't think is widespread, and I don't think is widely accepted. Some of these other things, Oedipus complex, I like what you said, that the way we accept that parents have a huge influence is sort of our way of saying the Oedipus complex matters. I'm not sure. And this Oedipus complex is an interesting point of tension between Freud and Lacan, because Lacan soured a bit on the Oedipus complex as his career trajectory advanced, and Freud himself thought it was one of his greatest discoveries. And so again, I think maybe he wasn't right about that. I go back and forth on Oedipus complex, because here's my I guess I would call it a psychoanalytic critique of the Oedipus complex, that I think one of the ideas of psychoanalysis is that we are unconsciously drawn to what is missing, right? What is not there. So how can it be, and Freud thought this, that we're initially most cathected to, invested in, sexually desirous of what is most proximate to us, meaning for him, because he was thinking in terms of Victorian Austria and England, the mother, right? So, okay, that to me, that just doesn't, it seems like you would desire what's missing in the mother. And maybe you can rethink Oedipus complex in that way, and that's fine. But I think that does, to me, that complicates that question. The other ones are I think, a little bit easier to deal with. Phallus, I find, or is such a fascinating thing. So my friend Alenka Zupancic has written a lot of great things on the phallus, and the way that if you don't talk, her point is, if you don't talk about the phallus, you let it operate as this mystery behind the scenes, as a figure of power. And it's psychoanalysis, by talking about it, that actually has demystified it. So her position, and this is the position of most of my women friends, but then again, most of my women friends are invested in psychoanalysis, is that psychoanalysis is one of the great feminist movements, because the basic wager of psychoanalysis, I think, is that the phallus is a fraud. It's a fraud. It's that phallic power is fraudulent. And so that is, to me, that's just a great feminist insight. So I don't care about what Freud's, I think he was pretty egalitarian, men and women, but to me, that doesn't even matter. What matters is the insight itself, which I think is a feminist one.
I think actually, you know what? Maybe we'll come back to Oedipus complex, because that, which you brought up about the feminist relation with Freud, I think is one of the biggest ways to break a prevalent thought taboo about Freud. And that thought taboo is like, well, he just didn't understand women. And I mean, like, at the level of anatomy, that's just true given what was available. But at the level of him somehow being, one, like, sexist, but also even sexist for his time, I think is contradicted by this idea of, what he really meant by things like penis envy and the phallus. And you said, the phallus isn't real, phallus being a sort of veil. Maybe elaborate on that a bit, and what he really meant by this thing called penis envy, because that's the thing that people really think is, one, either ridiculous or just straight up sexist, or both.
Yeah. So my friend who just died, Mari Rudy, wrote a book called Penis Envy, which is really, it's Penis Envy and Other Bad Feelings, I think, is the full title. It's worth people reading. And I think, but first, this idea of phallus, like, why is it a fraud? Well, because every expression for Freud of phallic power is, it's ultimately, and this is where Jacques Lacan comes along with this notion of the symbolic. It's ultimately only symbolic. And I liked how you said it's not real. It is not real. It's just, it has a purely symbolic status. And I think if you look at current figures of phallic power, you can see it's pretty, or not even current, but in the past too, it's really true that it's a symbolic power that doesn't have any real force behind it. And I think that's crucial to what Freud is saying. Now, about the question of penis envy, Mari says, and I like this, he says, it's men who really suffer from penis envy much more than women do, which I think is really great. But his point is just that if this thing is societally erected in a certain position, that's going to generate this feeling of penis envy. So it's not, for Freud, it's not a condemnation of people that suffer from it, or it's a descriptive analysis of how the structure is. But his point really is, this is something we need to rid ourselves of. Not some, and he's very clear about this, not something that we should say, oh, this is just inevitable. This is just because in a sense, penis envy is an error because it believes there's something substantial to the position of phallic power when there's nothing substantial to it at all. And again, I think our contemporary figures of phallic power show this pretty clearly if you look at them.
So to maybe recount what you just said there, is it basically that given the especially like the objective conditions of the time, that there's a patriarchal advantage that men have over women, why wouldn't women envy this symbolic power that men have, which the phallus? But what is more radical, is it saying that men just inherently have this power because they have it and it's real, or to say that power is ultimately kind of a veil, it's real because we believe in it?
Right.
And that realization is the radical component.
Exactly. You got it perfectly right. That's exactly what I would say. Yeah.
So in what ways has Freud influenced feminist thinkers? In what ways, I guess you could say, is there maybe a legitimate critique to be had? Because he's gotten criticized from, at least the ones I can remember, is Simone de Beauvoir criticized him, and Judith Butler also criticizes him, even though she seems to like Lacan quite a bit and usually references him somewhat positively, but isn't a Lacanian.
Right.
Yeah, tell us about that a bit.
Yeah. The main, so Butler thinks that Freud, and I think she thinks in the way that he described, and it's tied to the way he theorizes Oedipus complex. She thinks that he has a heteronormative depiction of infantile sexuality. That's basically the critique. I guess my response to that is that he says this very clearly in 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, that we have to recognize that heterosexual development is itself a problem. So I think he was the first person to say, okay, it's not the norm is sexuality, and then there's this deviance thing that's homosexual. No, heterosexuality, how you develop into being heterosexual, is a problem. And he very famously refused to analyze anyone that was homosexual with the idea of curing that. So I think, again, about the charge of homophobia, I think he's pretty clear, but I don't think Judith Butler has a feminist objection to him. So that, just to clarify that. But I do think you're right about Beauvoir. I'll speak about her in a second, because I love Simone de Beauvoir, and I think that situation could have not happened. But there was a whole slate of feminist thinkers in the 60s and 70s that really took Freud to task. And I think that's where and this is basic second wave feminist giants like Betty Friedan, Shulamith Firestone, Germaine Greer. And I think the idea for them, I think a lot of what they're responding to is the way psychoanalysis was practiced, right? Especially in America. So I don't know how much you can blame the person who originated something for how it ends up practiced 70 years after they wrote what they wrote. So maybe you can. And if you think you can, then I don't know what to say, because maybe you can say that about Freud. The Beauvoir situation is really interesting. So as she was working on Second Sex, she was, of course, Jean-Paul Sartre was her closest relation. And he And neither of them believed in the unconscious. So that's a fundamental barrier right there between that's going to come up. As good mid-century existentialists, they thought there can be no unconscious. So there's that. But she knew Lacan. They all knew each other. And she went to him and said, look, I'd like a few lessons on psychoanalysis. I'm working on this book, The Second Sex. Lacan says, no, we need to meet a couple times a week for 6 months. And then that'll give me the time to fully explain to you. And she said, I just don't have much time. I'm working on my book. I don't have much time to give. And so it never happened. And so I don't know who to blame in that. I guess just whoever you like more, you blame, or it's both of their faults, or it's neither of their fault. But it seems kind of sad that because I think Second Sex would have been a much different book if she had had those conversations with Lacan, because I think it would have become hopefully clear to her the way in which her critiques of psychoanalysis. I think that's one of the weakest part. It's a very strong book. It's like a Bible to me. But I think the critiques of psychoanalysis are not right. And I think it's in part because she didn't have this conversation with Lacan.
I guess some people might be frantically typing in the comments saying, well, didn't Freud say women are hysterical? I mean,
Yeah, but,
you know.
but he also said men were obsessional, and he thinks obsessional is worse than hysterical, right? So he, and look,
What do those
Freud-
mean, actually? That is
okay.
yeah, because there's obsessive, the psychotic, the neurotic, and the hysterical.
Right. So for Freud, in Freud's diagnostic schema, neurosis basically has psychosis is a separate category, and Freud thought, contra Lacan, this is an area they differed. Freud thought psychoanalysis can't do anything for psychotics. You're just off. You have anything. You have nothing to say to you. He analyzes a psychotic, but just a book written by a psychotic, a book by this guy, Daniel Paul Schreiber. Book's called Memoirs of My Nervous Neurosis. It's not one of Freud's greatest books because, again, I think he's not that great about psychosis. But for him, neurosis is a categorization that includes both, and then perversion's another one of these big categories. So psychosis, perversion, neurosis, and then within neurosis, for Freud, there's obsession, there's hysteria. Those are the two major categories of neurosis. There's also phobia, but that's for Freud a minor category. The main division is between hysteria and obsession. And Freud's cases, that the ones that he talks about, end up being divided between hysteria and obsession. And it's almost always the case that the women that he analyzes are hysterical and the men are obsessional. So that tends to be, and that's and there's social reasons for that. That tends to be the gendered divide. Although there are plenty of obsessional women and plenty of hysterical men. I mean, there's not, but that is the cliched just for social reasons. But the thing about even labeling women hysterical, Freud, my friend Joan Kopchak says this all the time. Freud was one of the first men who listened to what women had to say. So he was constantly listening. It's a talking cure. He's listening to what women have to say and developing his theory on that basis. So it's not, oh, you're hysterical, I'm not listening to you anymore. It's, no, you're hysterical, keep talking. I want to hear what you have to say, what you're going to reveal about the psyche to me.
I guess one might say that because of the limitations of what existed back then in terms of knowledge of female anatomy, is it even possible for, Freudian psychoanalysis to encapsulate the female experience, female subjectivity?
What do you mean by knowledge of female anatomy? I'm just curious what you're getting at.
Well, I mean, like they say, like, for example, like Freud just didn't, well, I mean, also wasn't adequate science. There was, understanding different ways men and women.
You mean like female
pleasure.
orgasm? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah. Mainly, especially.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's probably, I mean, that seems right. Like he doesn't have a good theory of female orgasm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that doesn't seem like a problem for me because that's not really, again, that's not his concern is really about how if it's a theory about how the psyche works, then I guess later discoveries about how orgasm functions will impact that, I guess. But I just think and I think obviously there are things that when you're reading Freud, you just say, okay, that's just part of his historical moment. Just like there are things that we've probably said in this conversation that are just stupid because in 100 years, maybe if the Earth's not blown up, somebody will say, "Oh, can you believe that they were talking about this when it's obviously that's not true?" So I think I don't have any problem with that. I think it's all the time that happens. That Hegel didn't believe in evolution, right? Hegel didn't believe in evolution. Does that mean everything he says is wrong? No. I mean, there's just parts where you just don't know what's because of the certain things that are available. That part is just that's just it's just it's not valuable. But okay,
Wait
go
a
ahead.
sec. When you say believe in evolution, didn't wasn't like that Darwin after Hegel
Yeah, yeah,
though?
yeah. But there were, yeah, this is interesting. I mean, of course, right. Darwin's after Hegel, but there were evolutionary thinkers. So the
Right.
question of evolution when Hegel lived was a, I don't know, 50-50
Mm.
proposition. So Darwin wasn't the first thinker to believe in evolution by any stretch. So there were a lot of thinkers that believed in evolution. He developed natural selection. So
Mm.
it's probably fair to say that if Hegel lived after Darwin, he would have accepted some
Mhm.
notion of evolution. But my point is, even he didn't accept even any notion of it at all. So
Mm.
that could, I think we would now say that's a blind spot.
Uh-huh.
And but doesn't to me that doesn't invalidate Hegel's
Right.
theoretically. Yeah. Same with Freud, I would just say.
With Freud, one idea that's very related to the unconscious, of course, and it's one that people have a strange relationship to, is this idea of repression.
Yeah.
It seems to kind of probably be, in my eyes, seems to be one of the most misunderstood ideas. And it was really learning about Lacan through kind of the likes of your lectures and, other people who have lectured on Lacan. Another person, who's a mutual friend of us, Michael Downs, really see like through that lens kind of got me to see some misconceptions. Like, is it that people have this idea of repression, something you keep deep down buried,
Right.
but like repression, it's kind of, I mean, what we have repressed is always being worn on our sleeve, no?
Right, right, exactly, and that's why Freud thought, and I think this is such a great idea that that other people know us better than we know ourselves, precisely for the reason you just said, because we wear what we repress on our sleeves. Just to come back to that earlier example I gave about using the ex-girlfriend's name. So I thought, oh, I'm in love with this new girlfriend. I don't even think about the old one, but it's true that I wasn't really. I was actually still attached to the one that I was no longer with because I was articulating it through the slip. And so what's repressed comes out on the surface. It's not hidden deep within. And I think that's I think that's one of these ideas that is true in Freud, but I think you can get from Freud this thing called, and he even uses the term, sadly, depth psychology. And I think what Lacan allows us to see is that no, the repression is on the surface, not deep buried within the depth. And it comes out. And this was part of what we were saying earlier about how you can't locate the unconscious. It manifests itself in interactions with people, not when I reflect on these things that I haven't tried to think about. And no, that's not how the unconscious or the repressed material is found. It's found through, and that's why psychoanalysis works through talking, because the idea is when you're talking to the analyst and supposedly free associating, then you're going to reveal something that is repressed that otherwise you wouldn't reveal. And you certainly wouldn't find it when you're just thinking about yourself. Thinking about, oh, what's that trauma deep inside of me? No, you're not going to find it that way because it's only available, on the surface.
So what does Freud mean by return of the repressed?
Yeah. So Lacan famously
Famous.
said, this is, yeah, I like this line by Lacan. He says, the, the repressed and the return of the repressed are the same thing. So that means the return of the repressed is just those moments when the thing that's repressed comes to you, then see it. It becomes evident. You can't avoid it. That's the return of the repressed. And Lacan's idea, this is not Freud's idea exactly, but I think it's implicit in Freud, is that there is no repressed that doesn't return at some time. So you can never, there's nothing that's fully repressed, so it never comes out. It's if it's repressed, it's going to come out in one way or another. You're going to make either you're going to, if you've repressed something, you're going to, well, let's say you have you're resentful to your children because they've taken away your time, right? So you've repressed that resentment. So it's going to manifest itself how? Well, okay, you yell at them. Maybe you forget the child in the car one day when you come home, or some kind of thing. That repressed idea is going to return. That's the idea.
One aspect also with repression, I mean, is the sexual repression, because it seems to be the
Sure.
context, like a big part of the debate between Freudians. Because if civilization is disconnect, he kind of thinks we need some level of repression. And then you have Reich, who's like the kind of opposite, who's like,
Yeah.
let's have none. What are some big misunderstandings regarding sexual repression for just, Freud's thought?
Yeah, there was a whole, you're right. Reich is one of the first figures, Wilhelm Reich. And then there's a whole Freudo Marxist movement in the 60s that basically, and Herb Marcuse in the late 50s, he wrote this book, Eros and Civilization. He doesn't exactly think this, but their idea is that we're suffering from excess of repression, or what Marcuse calls surplus repression. And we need to lift that, and then we'll be able to be more sexually free in our society. And I think what's interesting is Freud himself thought that up to about 1908, 1909. And then there's this other guy, Otto Gross, who had the Reichian idea, but even more extreme. He died very young too, because he's a kind of a wild living guy. Uh, uh, But Freud comes to say, no, you know what? His view becomes, it doesn't matter if society becomes totally non-repressive at all, because there's always this, or tries to be, because there's always this element of repression inherent in the social order itself. And that's what you reference civilization's discontents, that there's an antagonism always between the individual subject and the civilization, no matter how utopian our society becomes. And so the idea is that there's some kind of fundamental barrier to the full expression of our sexuality. And then Lacan comes along, and I think this is a point where he's, again, not changing Freud, but just making it a little more explicit. And his idea basically is that it's the obstacle to our complete fulfillment that ends up being the thing that drives our desire. So once you think about sex that way, then it all of a sudden becomes a lot more interesting and also complicated, because you can't just lift repression, because the obstacle to full sexual fulfillment is the source of our sexual desire. And I think this is really clear if you think about how clothes function, right? Like, can you imagine a more non-erotic place than a nudist beach? They just walk around. There's nothing, right? No one's excited. But if you see, I just noticed that the Cannes Film Festival disallowed nudity. You can't have dresses that have like any kind of thing exposed. And I thought that was interesting, because the point of those near nude dresses is always to arouse desire by almost showing, but not quite showing. But the key is the barrier, right? If there were just nude people walking up, if George Clooney and Juliette Binoche, if they just walked on the red carpet at Cannes naked, there'd be no eroticism to it at all, right? So I think that's where I think Lacan's contribution is really crucial. That the obstacle of the clothing actually is the key to the libidinous, erotic, sexual charge that we get.
Yeah, that brings us right to the drive and desire distinction, which I never thought was very clear in Freud, but is made clear by Lacan, right? But he building off an idea that Freud kind of like, I guess you could say, discovered in, what was it, the Beyond the Pleasure
Yeah,
Principle.
beyond the pleasure principle.
Right.
Right. Right. So he discovers this concept of the death drive or drive. I mean, Lacan will later say every drive is the death drive, right? So he brings those together. The reason why it's not clear the distinction between desire and drive in Freud is Freud never uses the term desire. So it doesn't, that's a Lacanian invention. But yeah, death drive, we should talk about that just a little bit. For Freud, again, it means the way in which we undermine our own prospects, the way we self-sabotage, the way we divert ourselves. And I think you can think about that in terms of this obstacle point, right? That in a way, desire gets mapped onto the death drive in terms of the obstacle to the object, right? Because it's not allowing us direct access, but that's the thing that creates our desire. So the way in which we subvert our self-interest is actually the way in which we sustain our desire. It's a very interesting way to think about it, I think.
So for Freud, it was Eros and Thanatos, kind of like life instincts, which would be, what do you actually want that might seem common sense and good for you, and then the death instinct is what's undermining that. And didn't he discover this kind of by seeing how patients, after being fully seemingly aware of what they needed to do and what was wrong, would undermine in very bizarre ways, their progress.
Yeah. Yeah, Tony, exactly. So you're just describing it perfectly. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he talks about this thing called the negative therapeutic reaction. And it's when a patient sees that things are going well and sees that they're on the road to recovery, they do something to sabotage the process. And for him, that was the really decisive moment. I mean, what led him there was the way in which people who had war neuroses kept dreaming about the traumatic experience, and that really confounded his theory of dreams, because his whole theory of dreams was the dream is the disguised fulfillment of a wish. So no one would wish to be back in a traumatic situation. So I got to explain that in some way. So then that's what led him to then the final blow to the pleasure principle was the negative therapeutic reaction. And you're right, Freud's conception of drive is always this divide between eros and death drive. He never uses the term thanatos, but other Freudians do, obviously. And
Yeah, I get that from Marcuse.
Yeah, for sure. Marcuse does it. I mean, everybody, you're right.
Right. Which, by the way, we can get to Marcuse a little later, because, Marcuse was my intro to a lot of thinkers, Freud, Hegel, Kant. And I really hope, I have the unpopular opinion that, well, it might not be unpopular with Zizekians, but I think Marcuse is a great thinker. I really like Marcuse.
Oh, I love Marcuse. Yeah.
But I think Eros and Civilization is his worst book.
Yeah, I think to me, that's unquestionably true.
It's the one that the Deleuzians like. That's the one all the Deleuzians really like.
Of course. My favorite book by him is the Hegel book, Reason and Revolution, which I think is quite good as a Marxist reading of Hegel. But yeah, I just think my point was just going to be that Freud, once he discovers death drive, and this is a point where I would be very critical of him. He tries to sustain some kind of dualism, but it's against his own impulse to be dialectical. And I think that's why he sustains this eros death drive opposition that Lacan will do. Lacan just doesn't, never mentions eros. He just gets rid of it. And I think that's a helpful move.
Okay, so this drive and desire distinction that Lacan makes, what is the difference? That we use them today as synonyms in our colloquial language. In what way is like is I guess I'll give my the
Yeah,
way
go ahead.
I
Yeah,
understand it is like
yeah.
desire is what we consciously want, and then drive is this impulse that will sort of undermine it, but also as a way to kind of allow us to keep desiring. Maybe at some level, could
Yeah,
that be considered a sort of drive undermining our desire?
for sure. Procrastination is a good example. I guess I would add one more term, and that's probably silly and needlessly confusing, but I would say there's a distinction between the conscious wish, the unconscious desire, and then the unconscious drive. And the difference between for Lacan, the difference. So Lacan thought desire was unconscious too, like drive, but he thought that desire has an object and drive doesn't. That's it. That's the difference. So basically, he describes what he calls a metonymy of desire. So I it's easiest to think about with romantic partners, right? Like you go from one, okay, I'm tired of that one. I go to the next one. She's tired of me. I go to the next one. So there's a metonymy of desire. But his point would be underlying that is the same drive that's indifferent to the object that I happen to have, right? So that's the drive desire distinction for Lacan. But you're right that the wish is what drive is, both desire and drive actually are undermining, are complicating our so it's that conscious wish that gets, I think, oh, I want to, okay. I think, let me give you an example. Like I think, oh, I want my summer to be this is my conscious wish for my summer. I want it to be totally free. I don't want any obligations. I just want to read some novels. What did I do? I just committed today to writing a book for some press that said, you can have the due date be anytime. I'm like, oh, I'll make it end of summer. So I commit. So why did I do that? Like just exactly against I had this, I was going to reread War and Peace. It was going to be such a nice summer. I was going to have so much fun. And that's all gone. So, so that, so that's the way in which the conscious wish, the drive just
We could
undermine.
we could say it in the Lacanian sense because you enjoy, working yourself,
Absolutely.
working the process of finishing a book, perhaps.
Absolutely. Right,
Enjoyment
right.
in the Lacanian sense, how is it different from enjoyment in the, I guess, common everyday sense?
I think the only way that it's different is that for Lacan, enjoyment includes suffering. That it means like I like to say this, you suffer your enjoyment, right? Like you have to, so it's, you're right. I enjoy working on those books and finishing them, but it's not pleasant. It's not pleasant. Reading reading a novel is pleasant, but there's clearly an enjoyment factor to that struggle of I can't get the idea. It's not coming. Oh, it's due. I'm not getting it done. What's happening? I can't think of it. I got to write 20 pages today. How am I going to do that? All that stuff. You're right. Like there's an enjoyment attached to it, but it's a suffering enjoyment. So that. I think that's the difference.
I guess one way I think a good example as well I could give is, I guess you would say the early Freud, for example, when it comes to procrastination. So I've been working on this two big projects for a long time. One is my democracy book, and which was supposed to be an easy book that I signed on because my dissertation was good enough to turn it into one. But
Yep.
I ended up completely transforming it and delaying it by 2 years and just adding to it. And also a big video essay, which explains every single type of Marxism to exist. Now, I've been consciously wanting to like get this over with, and I've been wanting to get it done. And, if we're to take the dominant understanding of what procrastination is, which is kind of like the older Freud, which would be we want to avoid pain and,
Pain.
seek pleasure, take the easy
Right.
route. But
Right.
I don't find myself ever procrastinating in the sense that I'm like watching TV or not, actually working. I'll just add a million side quests to the project.
Right.
Just keep adding more things to it that are probably, in the grand scheme of things, not always necessary. But it's just adding these side quests that are, related to it in some extent, but really like, why am I doing this? And I don't know how to explain that other than psychoanalysis.
I don't either. I don't either. I mean, procrastination in the way that you're talking about it, because if you're talking about it like, I'm just gonna play video games or do whatever, then that's pretty easy to understand, right? But according to pleasure principle. But complicating the project even more and then delaying it in that way, it seems to me that has to be thought of in terms of the death drive and the kind of enjoyment that the death drive produces. So it's I was just thinking of, did you see this thing where Donald Trump said he was justifying his receiving the plane from the gift of the plane, right? Of the new Air Force One. And he said, look, I'm not going to pay for it, and I'm going to just accept the gift, because the old golfer Sam Snead said, if someone gives you a putt, it's a give me, never put it out, just take the gift. And I thought, well, that's an interesting way to think about it, because I would always put it out, because I would think, oh, I need the practice, or I don't want to give me, I want to have the chance of missing it. I want to make it harder for myself. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because I think it's a kind of clear way in which pleasure principle and death drive are at odds with each other, right? That you can see the pleasure principle just takes the give me, and death drive creates some kind of problem, like you're adding these additional factors to your projects. It's a great project, by the way, of all the types of Marxism. I love that idea. Yeah.
It's been challenging, but I'm excited for it.
Yeah.
And another example is actually, our mutual friend Michael Downs. I remember when I was, talking to him on, I think it was a live stream or something, but it was, how despite not having, any formal training, not being in, not just grad school, like school period, how are you able to, learn as much as you did? I mean, all while working full time. And, he said, it's not like I have a massive work ethic or anything. It's not even like I'm like Mike Ross and have a super brain. It's just where my death drive is geared towards.
Yeah.
And I thought
Yeah.
that was really interesting, because it's like the drives sync up with that, which allows one to kind of enjoy torturing oneself and learning all of this.
It's really true. It's
Different
really
way
true.
to like
Yeah.
think of
Right.
getting good at something, right?
Right. It's totally different, right? Like somebody else can go parachuting, and that could be how theirs manifests itself. And mine manifests itself in writing a lot of books and reading a ton of things. But it is destructive, because I just was telling about this story about insomnia. It's terrible. Like I can't even sleep because of precisely of the same kind of drive to get things done. So it manifests itself one way or another, right? It's funny. I had a TA in a class who was she smoked, and I said, it's probably not a good idea that you smoke cigarettes. And she goes, yeah, no, I'm planning on quitting. And then I said to her, well, you're going to quit one way or another. And I thought she thought that was funny, but I think that's true of death drive. It's going to manifest itself one way or another. But it can't be in the way you consciously want it to manifest itself. You can't say, oh, I'm going to turn it into this productive way, not this destructive way, because it's always going to have a destructive element to it.
Hmm. So is it basically, in a snapshot, the drive undermines our desire so we can keep desiring, and that process of desiring is the enjoyment, not getting what we want, enjoying what we don't have.
Yeah. Hey, that
So
sounds like a
is
good
that what-
title for a book, actually.
Enjoying what we don't have?
Yeah, that was the title of one of my books. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I was gonna say. It sounds like it would be a title of one of your books.
Yeah.
What was the first one?
It was way early. I wish I hadn't used it up that early, because I really like it. So unfortunately, it's not that great, but oh well.
So
We live.
every drive is a death drive. Is that because drives are inherently, I guess you could say, not productive in a literal Darwinian sense, and that it's kind of counter to the actualization of desire?
Yeah. And counter to the good and to interest, self-interest. Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
So this completely shatters mainstream economics, doesn't it?
Well, that's right. And that's why in Capitalism and Desire and in my more recent book, Pure Excess, I really talk about once you think that way about the psyche, that requires us to think much differently about why we're doing what we're doing economically, because we're certainly not rational actors, which is one of the theories of, I think that's probably the primary economic theory today that we're basically rational actors. And I obviously think that's completely wrong. But I do think that capitalism relies on the death drive in many, and not just in the overall destructiveness of it, but just in the way that it helps, it gets people to want more even when they have enough, right? Like that's a really interesting, like the inability to say that that's enough is crucial to keeping the capitalist economy functioning, and yet it's a very destructive thing for the person that that feels like that. Right? Like, why can't Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or any of these guys say that's enough? Well, the fact that they don't keeps the motor running for capital. But I don't think we should necessarily feel sorry for them, but I'm sure it has very destructive effects on them psychically.
A big reason I wanted to always do one episode, because I don't feel like I have the, you know, knowledge to fully like do a video why Freud was right. I really want at some point want to get to collaborate with someone on a video script for that. But what compelled that originally was I have an older video called The Burnout Society, which is heavily based on Byung-Chul Han and a
Sure.
bit of Mark Fisher too. And in that, at one point, I kind of inserted a little bit of what was heavily inspired by capitalism and desire, and then mentioning that desire is ultimately rooted in lack, and that we have the capitalist system is predicated on essentially selling you the fantasy that you can fill this, and it's never by nature it can't meet that, and like because a lot of criticism of self-help is that it doesn't really work in filling the void or whatever, but like by very nature it can't. And that's
Right.
what I tried to say in that. And I remember a couple of at least like a few YouTube comments were saying, I took you seriously until you mentioned Freud. Until you mentioned
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
psychoanalysis.
yeah,
They were like,
yeah,
"Oh, that's just outdated." And I'm
yeah.
thinking like, well, forget the person. That idea is pretty important. And I mentioned fantasy, and you're saying this what keeps the system going, right? In terms of why it's never enough. Fantasy in psychoanalysis, I find to be absolutely fascinating. Tell us
Absolutely
about that a
crucial.
bit.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So you're right. Like this fantasy that I will find. This is the capitalist fantasy, right? That and it's promulgated at every turn, that I will find the correct commodity to create, that will fill my lack, that will create plenitude for me. And as long as you're the victim of that fantasy, then you're going to be constantly producing or consuming more and more and more and more. And that's the engine behind the capitalist structure. So yeah, I think that you're right to think that that fantasy is absolutely crucial. And the problem with fantasy is that it's like with most things with Freud, it's primarily unconscious, right? So people don't think like, oh, I have this fantasy that if I just find the right commodity, everything. No, they don't think that consciously, but that's what's driving.
Yeah, fantasy seems to be so important in psychoanalysis that they spell it differently.
Well, that's a
And it's
British American thing.
Oh, is that it? Okay,
Yeah,
yeah, 'cause
it's not a yeah,
that
it's not
has
a
nothing to do with psychoanalysis. Because I always found
n
it odd that, like, in
no,
most
it's
languages with the F, and then
yeah, yeah, yeah.
whenever
No, 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 no,
whenever
no.
I
No,
read it in the works, it was with the PH.
no, it's just a British American thing.
Okay.
It's a totally meaningless distinction. Yeah.
So what
Yeah.
is, how does the psychoanalytic view of fantasy differ from, the idea of fantasy like a dream of sorts? And I wanna mention Zizek has this great quote I love, which is,
Yeah.
how if we it's very easy for us to talk about our dreams, like what we dreamt last night. It's very hard to talk about our daydreams because the daydreams are like, more fantasy based.
Fantasies, yeah.
Yeah.
Does he say that? Where does he say that?
Yeah, I think it's Plague of Fantasies.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a great point. And I think, right, the fantasy, it's a kind of a this is a way psychoanalysis is different than normal psychology, right? Because I think normal psychology would say, well, your fantasies, that's the easiest thing. You want to see your fantasies realized, and then you'll feel better. The point of psychoanalysis is the last thing you ever want is the realization of your fantasy, because your entire sense of reality is structured by the fact that your fantasy is not realized within it. In fact, that's how we know we're dealing with reality from a psychoanalytic perspective is it doesn't perfectly correspond to our fantasy. That's how we know it's real. That's reality testing, basically. And the other thing I would say about that is that why don't you want to have that? I think the fundamental emotion we feel about our fantasy is shame. And that's why if it gets exposed, we feel completely riven with shame. I remember even when I was doing analysis, I couldn't even, I was doing free association, whatever, I have to say whatever. And so we're talking about my fantasy and I couldn't pull the trigger. I just lied to the analyst. I know you're just not supposed to do that. I just could not reveal my fantasy. It's just too humiliating for me. I just felt too much shame about it. So I think that's really interesting. And I think that's again a way that psychoanalysis conception of fantasy is totally different than the ordinary idea, because the ordinary idea would be, okay, it might be a little embarrassing, but you could at least tell the therapist but no, I think if it really is this structuring foundational thing for you, then you can't tell anyone.
It might seem off topic, but I find it was a fascinating way that I've made sense of psychoanalysis in my own life, is that I really like to keep track of the music I listen to in playlists based on a sort of certain time period. And I find like a lot of, it's really hard to be aware of fantasies because they're, unconscious. But I think of like, at least like the closest attempt I've seen at understanding some fantasies is what do I think of when I'm listening to music and pacing around? Like what am I imagining? And like who is the ideal ego in that, imagination?
Yeah.
It being like who am I imagining myself as? And who is the ego ideal? Like who's watching? Who is this for?
Right. And who's the object in it, right? Like,
Right.
I think that's such a great, I once heard someone, it's not a psychoanalytic person, someone say that your favorite music is always the music that you listen to when you've sexually came of age. And I
Mhm.
thought it's kind of interesting. It's exactly kind of the point you're making, right? That the music, when you first heard that song, has a certain phantasmatic resonance for you. And that it always brings that up when you hear that song again. I think that's really true. Yeah, I think it's a really fascinating point about the way fantasy functions, and again, plays a structuring role for us psychically.
There's that whole mishearing thing, which I know you had a whole episode on why theory. I really like that episode.
Yeah, that's Ryan's thing. He wants to write a book on mishearing because he thinks it's really important. But I think it's great. It's so true in songs, right? It's more true in songs than anywhere else. I think that our favorite example is this song by the Cocteau Twins called, it's his favorite example, but I've stolen it, called Ice Blink Luck. And in the song, it sounds just like they're saying cherry cola and they're really saying something about coal. So it's a fascinating example. But yeah, the mishearing, what do you hear? You hear what your fantasy
Mhm.
directs you to hear, right?
Right, which is that kinda unconscious language
Sure,
component, right? Like, what
sure,
we
sure,
thought someone was saying is indicative of what we're thinking.
sure, sure.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and, like, sometimes the lyrics of the song itself, we might not think play a role, but, I mean, are often connected to that fantasy. But
Right.
this fantasy thing, I wanna stick on that for a moment. So, you said the worst thing that could happen is someone actualizing their fantasy.
Yeah.
That's pretty counterintuitive to just most wisdom,
Yeah.
period. I mean, like,
Yeah.
counter to, like, the identity of being an American to some extent, the American dream, right?
Yeah. 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 Because the problem is that your fantasy is it puts you in a, so again, your reality is structured around it not being true. So if you inject that fantasy into the reality, all of a sudden you lose your bearings on the reality, and you you lose the very thing that animates your being. And I think that's why it's real. I mean, it's humiliating for other reasons. You feel shameful about it because it's so close to you. But I think the other thing is it really, you no longer have the thing that drives your, that animates you. And I think that really is, it's tough to deal with, right? Like, think about how, and this is a minor example, it's not a perfect example, but think about how when a sports figure wins a championship, they almost don't know what to do. They're sort of at a loss. And I think it's because even though that's been the fantasy driving them, they no longer have that thing that was animating their existence. And it can be very hard. It can be depressive even, I think, for people. But even more, I mean, again, the main problem is that the fantasy is so close to you and it's so tied to your unconscious that to get it exposed is horrific. It's like if I don't know, maybe you ever had this, maybe some people listening have had this happen, but if your parent, when you're older, your parent does something to treat you like you're still a little kid, right? Like, and that you say, "Oh, please, mom, dad, don't do that." That's what happens basically if your fantasy is exposed. So this aspect of your that's so close to you gets exposed publicly.
Yeah, with regard to fantasy, we're one area where I think it's very observable and exemplifies, at least for me, a lot of psychoanalytic concepts is hip hop. And I really like the genre of hip hop because it's so heavily wordy, and you can really like get an idea of the person's
Sure.
unconscious through what they're saying. And even if it might seem like they're just talking shit or whatever, but it's often highly indicative of a lot of things. And a constant theme I see with the most successful artists is this sort of suffering from success trope,
Oh,
which is
interesting.
where it's not always like explicit, but it's this sense of bragging, but also feeling very depressed.
Mhm.
Feeling depressed, bragging about how many, how much money they have, cars or women, but it'll be a depressive undertone, and then but the one woman who got away will undermine them. It's like you see this constantly in The
Yeah,
Weeknd's music or Drake's music.
yeah,
This depressive celebration of success, a or melancholic, you know, themes, talking about success, but then bringing it back around to, like, the one missing object still is this
right.
one woman or whoever couldn't get away or this thing I need to prove. And it's interesting because, I mean, I can only imagine, right? You have your conception of fantasy boils down to what are literal objects, at
Right.
least the, level of cars or whatever. That is a kind of fantasy that is, at least if you have a lot of money, attainable. And if you attain that, what next?
Right.
There's gonna
Right.
be a lot it's difficult to animate someone's desire further if one's fantasy is based on an object that is, because it's always based on object, right? But it's an impossible object
Yeah,
because
it's
it's
an
an endless
impossible
thought.
object. Right. Right.
But if the
Right.
placeholder for that impossible object is a literal object that is highly attainable, again, if you have money, that kind of probably would confuse someone upon getting it.
Right. I think it's totally befuddling. And I mean, those songs make sense to me because if you clearly, if you have all the things that you thought you wanted, and then you're still feeling right, existentially barren, psychically empty, all these things that everybody feels, then you're gonna say, well, there's some kind of problem. And that's I think that again, I think we see that all the time. That's it's it's the problem with the whole capitalist structure and what it promises, right? Like it can't there's no there's no way to there's no way to win at it because if you win, then you find that you've lost. And I think that's the, I mean, for lack of a better word, that's the sad part about structure.
Could we say that might have also been an issue with 20th century socialism? in that 20th century socialism in many ways promised a lot of what capitalism promised.
Right.
Like it promised more abundance, more, in many ways, the Soviet Union competed on those grounds of capitalism.
Yeah, but it didn't. I mean, I think that's an interesting take, and maybe that's true, but it didn't really deliver. I mean, it
Yeah, well,
didn't.
exactly, which is why I think it set itself up to fail because
Yeah, that's
it,
probably
it
true.
the
That's
idea
probably true.
on that ground of like
Yeah.
abundance, capitalism just is superior.
Right, precisely because of this the way in which fantasy functions in it and drives people to do more and more and more and more, right? And the way that this doesn't work in socialism, I think, that the way that that every time you win, you feel like you've failed. And so you have to do more. And I think that really helps keep the capitalist engine functioning in a way that doesn't work in socialism, which is why I think that's a large reason. I like your point. That's part of why that communist experiment totally failed. It's not just that they didn't deliver, it's that they were buying into the same promise.
And even in your work, I think it's actually an Emancipation After Hegel, where you critique the kind of communist idea of, you know, a sense in which that at this final stage there'll be kind of like a full realization
Yeah.
of human needs, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, or could we see communism, at least, so this is how I rationalize to myself the idea of communism, because I would say, like, and if I'm asked as to whether I'm a communist, I usually say a socialist, because the hard C for me, communism is like a wager. I don't even know if
Right.
it's legit, or I think communism is a stage after socialism, for at least how I see it, and we won't know till it's there. But I think if anything, it functions kind of like a nirvana sort of fantasy almost that might drive people to at least make the world better.
Mhm.
But if we
Sure.
take, could that be it's impossibility, be a good thing? Because if we're to take the idea literally, like, I think there is a sense in which people think maybe their problems will be fixed under communism, which I think is probably delusional.
Yeah, Marx even thought that. Like he and Jenny would say to themselves, well, after the revolution, blah, 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 we won't have this problem. So I think that, yeah. And I feel like, yeah, it's an interesting question. If you take the signifier communism to name consciously, to name an impossibility, does it then can then it become the center of a more workable political project? Maybe. I don't know. That seems possible to me. I just, as you said, from Emancipation After Hegel, I have a real problem with the idea of overcoming alienation, overcoming contradiction, any of these things, and achieving some kind of unleashing our human flourishing. I'm totally against that. So I'm for, I mean, that's fine, but to me, the more our flourishing is unleashed, the more our suffering is unleashed too. So, okay, if you want to pay the price for that, okay, but there's always a cost. I mean, I don't mean that in a capitalist sense, but there's always a psychic s- cost for something, I think.
You have a whole book on embracing alienation. That's
I
one
do.
I have
Yeah.
not. That's one I have not read yet. Although I did listen
Yeah.
to your lecture on your YouTube channel on it, and so, like, that sounds pretty counterintuitive to Marx and Hegel. In
I don't
that,
think it's counterintuitive to Hegel at
no,
all.
sorry,
I
not
think
not Hegel. I mean, yeah, well, Marx and
for
Marcuse
sure Marx. Right,
and
right,
people
right.
like
And
that.
Marcuse and
It's-
Frankfurt School
Yeah,
probably. Yeah.
this is like
Yeah.
alienation. This thing that is part of why capitalism is bad, right? And we want to overcome it,
Right.
but
But
or is it like alienation just part of the human condition? Is that
yeah, that's what I say. And then I say the problem with capitalism isn't that it alienates us, but that it hides our fundamental alienation. So I kind of switch the problem around a little bit.
so? What does that mean in kind of, you know, like in an everyday sense? I mean, the idea that we should
Well,
embrace
let me give you an
alienation.
example. Okay, yeah, I'll give you an example. So, you
What
mean
even is
embracing it?
alienation, I guess, to the real newcomers?
No, no. Alienation is our distance from ourselves. So all the ways in which we're not harmonious or balanced with ourselves. So that can be unconscious, conscious. It can be absence, presence. It can be that kind of thing. But it can be being and nothing. But I think the way that capitalism hides, so embracing alienation just means not trying to overcome that distance within the self through some kind of harmonious state that you're aiming for, or some kind of capitalist fantasy, idea of pure plenitude, communist or capitalist. And the way my argument is that capitalism hides our alienation by making us so I think a typical quasi-Marxist analysis of a terrible job, say, would argue that job is alienating, right? But I want to say, no, actually, the worst jobs are the ones that aren't alienating at all, that make you feel like you're identical with just this job. And that's how capitalism functions. So it actually hides our alienation from us. So that's the argument about, there's one chapter on capitalism. It's not much.
That seems to overlap with Byung-Chul Han's thing about how today, you're not expected to just have a job. It's supposed to be your career, your vocation.
Correct. Yeah.
I don't just do data analysis so I can pay the bills and whatever. I am a data analyst, and I believe in project management, and my identity as being an achiever to move up the whatever.
Yeah.
That could be like, it's on the surface less alienating, I guess, but worse, because you are becoming, your species being, perhaps to use a Marxist term, is becoming the thing.
Sure.
Okay. Does that relate in some sense to the seeming change, probably perhaps one of the biggest cultural changes of 21st century to the 20th century, of like repression, and that like today it's not about keeping things secret, taboos. It's all about expressing yourself and how we should. It's almost therapism is kind of part of the dominant culture.
It is for sure.
The urban monoculture.
Yeah, for sure, Tony. I just think that expression can be a great way of repressing. I was trying to make it rhyme, but it can be a great way of repressing, right? Like, it's not just because you say a thing openly doesn't mean you're not repressing it, right? Because the idea can be repressed in the very articulation of it. And I think that's one of the really fascinating ways that this is something that Lacan, I think, adds to what Freud is saying, because Freud's dealing more with classical repression, and Lacan is already sensing this world to come. And his idea is, by saying something, you can actually hide. And one of the ways examples he gives is there's a painting contest among it's a story about two Greek painters, and they try to see who can paint the most realistic, I think it's most realistic birds or something, or I forget. And the one guy does his painting. It's really realistic, looks great. And then the other guy paints a curtain. And that's the winner of the contest, because the curtain makes it seem like there's something hiding behind. And I think saying the thing that revealing all has this same function like the curtain, like what's behind that I'm missing when that person is revealing all. So even when someone reveals everything, there's still a repressed content, because that's a way of hiding that there's nothing to hide. Even if they're saying the very thing that is repressed, the fact that they're saying it makes us think there's something behind it. So then the repression still functions.
That seems awfully relevant to a lot of activism. That, we just need to speak out about the thing.
Right. For sure. Right. I think it does complicate activism. Yeah.
Is that what Zizek calls disavowal, or fetishistic disavowal, or is that something different?
Yeah. So, right. Exactly. So fetishistic disavowal is when you're actually saying a thing that you're not taking into account its psychic effect, right? So you're by saying it, you're avoiding its psychic effect. So yeah, so that would be an example of it.
Hmm. Back on the drive desire thing, because I want to hammer this. One of the favorite examples I like that you give is that of in Mad Men. How Mad Men illustrates a lot of Lacanian ideas.
Yeah.
And I know, for the listeners who haven't watched Mad Men, I mean, I I won't give you a synopsis, but I feel like at this point you just got to watch Mad Men if you listen to the show. It's such a good show.
Yeah.
But it's one that I found like I appreciated so much more because of, what I know of psychoanalysis. And like Don Draper just illustrates so many components of drive and desire. I mean, tell us about
Yeah.
that a bit. As an
Yeah,
example.
Draper. Someone was interviewing me after I wrote Capitalism and Desire, and they said there's two hidden heroes of Capitalism and Desire. She said, "Can you guess who they are?" Because it's a kind of nice psychoanalytic little game. And I said, "Well, one is certainly Hegel." And I said, "The other, I don't know. Is it Freud?" She said, "No, Freud's not a hidden hero." She said, "Guess again." And then I couldn't guess, and she said, "It's Don Draper. Don Draper's your other hidden hero." And I think a couple things, right? So he knows how to attack the fantasy of people, and that's why the advertising agency is such a great venue for a show, because it's all about what is structuring people's fantasy. And then he has this great discussion. I think, who's he talking to? Is it Cargill or maybe or Dow, maybe Dow Chemical? And he's trying to recruit them. And he says, you have right now half the market, but you don't want half, you want it all. And then he says this great line about happiness. He says, happiness is the moment just before you get more happiness. And I thought that is just such a perfect psychoanalytic thing. But then what's really fascinating about Draper, I think, and true, and Peggy too, and on the show to a equal extent, I think, is that they're both able to perform a kind of ethics of psychoanalysis. That is, they're able to undergo a symbolic death and then emerge out of it. And that's how Don Draper becomes Don Draper. The actual Don Draper dies and he takes on his identity, but then it happens several other times during the show. So they've made their money selling cigarettes and they're losing their cigarette accounts. And he devises a plan to publish a full ad saying we're never going to take cigarette ads anymore because they're too unhealthy. So there's that. And then there's a time where they just, to save their agency, they fire everyone from the agency. So there's all these great moments where we can see the death drive is obviously working in the production of capital, but it's also working in this other, what I would call ethical way in Don Draper's, the rest of his existence.
And it's also that like he's plagued by this constant getting what he wants but not being satisfied.
For sure. For sure. I feel like, and the show ends with him still on this quest for more. I'm going to find something satisfying. And then he invents this, I'd like to teach the world to sing famous ad from the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted the show to end at the end of season 6, where he takes his kids back to the brothel where he was raised, because I thought, okay, this would be him really getting the point that I can get out of here, sure, but I'm never going to really fundamentally escape my psychic condition. And I thought that would have been a great revelation, but the show I think was a little cynical and chose this other ending. So I don't like the ending, but I mean, it's fine. I don't hate it, but it just didn't end quite at the right point. I didn't think.
I know because you teach film studies, of course. Or I'm pretty sure you've used this example actually, but if you haven't, I'm sure you'd find it interesting. Is like in Taxi Driver, one scene that I always find interesting to see how people react to when they've watched it is the movie theater scene when he brings the girl. He's interested into to the porno theater,
Civil Shepherd,
and
yeah.
and of course she rejects him after and thinks it's weird.
Yeah.
And like the way most people interpret that is, oh, he's just like autistic or weird, and why would he do that? But like the way I always read it, from more psychoanalytic views, he seemed very well aware of what he was doing, but he kind of wanted to undermine his, desire.
Yeah. 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 That's really good. I think that's right. I think that's totally right. That he found a way to make it impossible for her to stay with him or to go out with him further. Because she was a fantasy object. I mean, it comes back to this point about not wanting our fantasy realized, right? Yeah.
Right. Why are movies often, because I notice this is a tendency with psychoanalysis seems to be taught almost more in film studies and literary studies than it
Yeah.
does in like mainstream psychology. I mean, well, first off, like, why is that the case? That's kind of counterintuitive. And also, why does it seem like movies are easier to illustrate psychoanalytic concepts than real life?
Real life. Well, I think there's a good answer for that, is that what is a film except a collective fantasy? Right? Like that's a film is a collective fantasy. So I think the fact that every film is trying to tap into your unconscious fantasy tells us it has some psychic importance, even when it fails. I think almost every film to me is interesting, even the worst ones. So there's that. And then I think, yeah, I mean, literature, same thing, a little less, because I think the visual aspect ties into the fantasy aspect a little bit more. But yeah, the first big wave of film theory was totally psychoanalytic. And then it had a downtime. And now, is it back? I don't know. Maybe. It depends who you talk to. I still can't get into the main film studies conference. I would reject me. So it's not totally back. There's a little group of us who write on and think about cinema and psychoanalysis, but it's not the majority by far. There's really no theory in film studies. It's just historical. This is historical. So,
But more so, why is it not taught as much in psychology?
well, I think there's a couple reasons for that. I think drugs have become really the pharmaceutical dimension has taken over, and I think they have a certain kind of effectiveness for sure, and people have seen that, and that's an easier way to go about it. And the other thing I think is I think that there's a choice made to say I think there's something dangerous about psychoanalysis as an academic discipline, that it doesn't really fit, and it's because of the way it taps into the unconscious. It's always going to be dicey and problematic and hard to fit within the barriers of an academic discipline. So I don't know that it ever could comfortably be an academic discipline, frankly. I just don't think it can, just because of that. It's just the unconscious is to focus on the unconscious is always to focus on what doesn't fit. And so that to me is the main problem.
With the unconscious, I just realized we haven't talked about Freud's dream theory, which when one Googles like what Freud got right, what he got wrong, because I kind of wanted to see like what is the sort of consensus, so to speak, and if you do like a perplexity search, if you know what perplexity is, it's sort of AI deep research that will like research what all of the sources have kind of said and try to form a consensus, but it often more just tells you whatever is the dominant view.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like Freud's dream theory seems to be one of the things that a lot of people think is bull. Like a lot of they'll say actually the dreams are just random. They have
Yeah.
nothing of that unconscious significance. What do you say to that, and what are some maybe misconceptions regarding like that?
I don't know. I guess if you want to believe that, you're going to believe that. I feel like Freud said about interpretation of dreams, insights like this fall to one but once in a lifetime. He was utterly convinced that was the great work. And I think the notion that the dream is a result of the unconscious seems to me to be best. I can't. It's hard for me to think of a dream that I've had that hasn't. Of course, I'm already thinking in a Freudian way, so there's a little vicious circle at work that doesn't resonate unconsciously. So I guess I would just say the problem. I think it's just again, it comes back to this. There's something very troubling about the Freudian idea of dreams, and I think that's why it doesn't fit into a so nicely into an academic into why people aren't willing to accept it. It's just it's in a way a horrible. I don't mean this in a bad way, but it's a horrible theory because it means that somewhere your unconscious desired this nightmare that you have constructed for yourself, or this whatever, or this whatever terrible thing that you're dreaming, even if it seems good. So yeah, I think that's what I would say about that. I think it's one of these points where Freud hit something that's traumatic, and then that's why it's rejected.
And maybe also because it's just hard to empirically prove. And
Well, I don't think you could empirically prove it.
yeah,
Right.
because
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
also just one experience that made this clear for me is when I was taking psychology electives in university. And you if you really want if you wanna get a grade of 100%, or just if you wanna boost your grade if you're lacking, you have to sign up for these tests to actually be a subject doing, like, for research that, like,
Right.
they ask you a bunch of questions, they make you never see how you react to this and that. And often I found just from kind of doing the tests, like, looking back on it, I don't think one would get a very accurate view of the phenomenon they were studying by taking what I say literally.
Right.
Because sometimes you're
Right.
asked these questions, but you don't really know, right? You're just giving what might be a response out of ego or out of what you
For
want to
sure.
prove,
Right.
or
For sure. For sure.
right?
Right.
So it's
Right.
like hard to test. And part of how I square this, is Freud's dream theory bull. I mean, probably like we have experienced so many dreams that probably a lot of them are just random, but what's more important is the dreams we remember.
Right.
And why do we remember those dreams must have something to do with the,
Right.
unconscious,
Right.
because to remember them means verbalizing them.
Right.
So it's like, surely there's still relevance there. That's how I think of it. Because the
Yeah.
dreams that I remember are the ones that usually do have some significance to, like, the stuff I've, my desires and stuff.
Right, right. Me too. Me too. It's funny because I taught a class called Sopranos and the Unconscious, and we read Interpretation of Dreams, and the students, there wasn't a single student that wasn't convinced by that. So there wasn't that much resistance to that idea. So that's funny.
You actually talk about Sopranos a lot, like, when it comes to, psychoanalysis metaphors. What makes that show so special when it comes to, I guess, looking at it through a psychoanalytic lens?
Well, just that it's explicitly about a psychoanalyst,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah.
yeah, so I don't I
But I
usually
mean more than that, because I mean, there's just so much
well,
questions.
I think Tony is a great example of somebody, and all the other guys too, obviously, driven by the unconscious in ways that they just have no idea about, right? And so that I think that really is captured pretty well by this show. I don't tend to love gangster things, but I think Sopranos is pretty good. But yeah, but I think that's the thing. Like I think in the other thing I like about it is that it shows how the criminal breaks the law, but doesn't break the symbolic pact, right? Like they're still just as invested in capitalism, accumulation, all the kinds of objects that everybody's invested in. They just take a different route to get there. So I think it kind of, one of the things it does is it undermines the notion that the criminal is a radical figure. I hate that idea. I really hate the idea that criminality is radicality. I think criminality is just criminality. Just it should be punished. I have no sympathy for criminality. And And I think that show really conveys that idea pretty well.
Hmm. I'm tempted to go into that itself, but since we have limited time on this segment, I think, we've talked about what we think Freud got right, and it's really hard to say how did Freud actually get this right, other than it just feels true. Like what, like when you kind of get across these ideas, what actually makes sense of reality. I think you put it in a way in one of your Why Theory episodes, which is psychoanalysis seems to be one of the only disciplines that takes people as to how they actually are. It doesn't build a theory of how people should be or and then kind of impose it. It just kind of actually just observes what is true at the level of subjective experience,
Right.
less
Right.
so like whatever brain signals or whatever tests. It's like ultimately how do like just looking at people, what do they do? And
Right.
what's to explain that?
I think it's a key thing is to look at actions and those and the way the unconscious manifests and the death drive manifests themselves in actions. I think that's exactly right.
So we've talked about what Freud got ostensibly right. What did Freud get wrong in your view? And you've alluded to a few things already as to what like Lacan differed with Freud on, but what do you think Freud was straight up just wrong about?
Okay, so for me, I've already mentioned Oedipus complex and why. I think the other one that's maybe going to be surprising to some people. The other one is religion. I think Freud just completely. I think he's right about some religious belief that it's desire for a parental authority that's flawless. But I think what he misses is the way in which religious belief is also a way of, how to put it, paying homage to what cannot be grasped, to this what Lacan would call a gap within signification, this hole in the universe, that religious belief is in a way when you bow down and pray, you're acknowledging your own fundamental what my friend Rick Boothby calls unknowing. And I think that that's really an important human thing that's not just a stupid error on people's part. So that's a big one. I think Freud is just see it as a prejudice, just an enlightenment prejudice against religion. And then I'm more of a leftist than Freud. So yeah, I mean Freud like Lacan. They were both conservatives. So I'm so politically I share a lot of Freud's pessimism, maybe all of it, but I think we can do certain things politically to ameliorate the social order and that we should try to do them. So those are maybe those three, if you count Oedipus complex, those are the three main ones, but they're not major things at all. Someone accused me of being a Freud denier because I attack Freud, but I am anything but. I probably feel maybe Hegel's the exception, but I was going to say I feel closer to Freud than any other thinker. So these little things are not in any way a way of trying to renounce him or anything. Like I really am attached to Freud as a thinker.
You just mentioned they're both Lacan and Freud are conservatives. I mean, what does that mean in their context? Because I think people hear the word conservative, and it's hard to imagine, like, given his penis envy theory and what we contextualize with that, how because in some ways he's progressive, but like you mean politically in the context of like
Politically.
Vienna when there's
Yeah.
Bolshevism, socialism around.
Yeah. He was not, they were
Lacan
not.
during May '68,
Yeah.
famously, what was it with that guy who looked like Guy Debord who intruded his lecture.
Yeah. Yeah. And he said the guy took off all his clothes in front of Lacan during his lecture. And Lacan said, okay, you think that provokes me? It doesn't. And then he's famously said to the revolting students, you want a master, you'll have one. And so, okay, it turned out that was true. But he was just he was politically conservative. He was a Gaullist. He was just right down the line. He did not think, because both of their views we're not going to change society for the better. And all these attempts to, we think, and again, Freud changed his mind later in his life, but all these attempts to make society to progress things there's always this unconscious negative side to that. So I think that's why they both were more conservative. Obviously, they weren't, in our context, they wouldn't have been AfD voters in Germany or Marine Le Pen voters in France or something like that. So it's not like that, but they would have been on this,
Probably been
just a,
Democrats, Biden or Clinton
but
Democrats.
right, by
And
now.
I think are the
right,
real conservatives now. Because I think
right, by
populist
now.
right
Right,
is like,
right.
it's like not conservative. It's like which doesn't make it better. It makes it worse, actually. I think.
Right. I mean, it's really right. I mean, what's considered right wing today in all these, in Europe and in the U.S. is very radical. So I think you're right that in our terms, they would be moderate Democrats. That's what they would be. Yeah.
Yeah, like the people preserving, like today now, it's like the Democrats are preserving the, due process constitution,
Sure.
which is not leftist, and it kind of annoys, the leftist part of me
Right.
that knows we need to change those things.
Right. And
But
or,
like
or
better than like Trump basically like full on undermining, that increases authority.
right.
So,
Or they support the independence of the FBI, independence of the CIA. Like those are not wild leftist projects, but that's the kind of thing they would say. I mean,
right.
Freud wasn't so far right wing that he supported Hitler. He had to leave Austria when Hitler invaded. So, yeah, there's a limit to the conservatism of both of them. And Lacan's daughter was a Maoist. So, and his son-in-law was a Maoist. But now,
Really?
yeah, Jacques-Alain Miller
Fascinating.
and Judith Miller were Maoists, and he even had to get Judith out of jail for political activity. But now Miller is a bit of a conservative, so it's a kind of move
Huh.
full circle.
Fascinating. Because
Yeah.
one of the Millers popularized a lot of Lacanian psychoanalysis, no?
Well, Jacques-Alain Miller edited every single seminar
Really?
and is one of the main popularizers. Yeah, and he runs right now the World Association of Psychoanalysis, called WAP, which is the Lacanian World Organization. So he's an he's in his 70s, still powerful guy. And he was a Maoist when he met Lacan in 1964. So, yeah.
That's fascinating. I was thinking about Badiou for a bit, and I know you like Badiou, and my mentor in grad school, Assad Haider, kind of basically, introduced me to Badiou, and that was a rabbit hole
Yeah.
that opened up a lot of things, which we don't have time to get into now, but maybe in the backroom conversation potentially. Maybe just the last thing to touch on, and it's something I forgot because it is kind of one of those things that is brought up when people like to dismiss Freud. It's his stages of child development,
Yeah.
right? In the phase of sexuality and child development. A lot of people seem to discredit that. What do you think of that?
I should have said that. I have no investment in that, and Lacan has no investment in that. So I don't think that's a crucial part of the theory, and I don't think it. I think that's something we're probably.
I almost forgot about it. That's why.
Yeah. I just
Lacan
think
never mentions it, and
Never.
it's brought up. I remember it was brought up when we had like a brief intro in a psychology class about what Freud's ideas were, and that was brought up.
I know they always hold on to the worst ideas in those introductions, which is too bad.
Yeah. Like, well, it sounds like bull crap, but let's just dismiss him. Yeah, in any case, I think we've hit the mark for this episode on Freud. I'd highly recommend listeners, we're more curious to explore these ideas, to check out Why Theory, particularly in defense of Freud, episodes 1 and 2. I think you have 2 episodes, right?
I think so, yeah.
And a lot of your lectures. And anything else you want to plug before we move to the backroom segment?
I do have a book coming out, which is the Cambridge Introduction to Jacques Lacan, which is an attempt to write, which attacks Lacan for his language and his attempt to write it in the clearest form possible. So we'll see how that goes.
Nice. Anyways, thanks for being here, Todd. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm
Thanks for having me.
Very excited to talk about Hegel in the back room, all about Hegel, and particularly his most misunderstood idea, it seems, and most popular idea simultaneously, is dialectics.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimists, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens, and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.